There is a silence that follows betrayal, a silence so loud it drowns out everything you once believed. It isn't just about what they did, it's about what it did to you. The questions it forced you to ask, the trust it shattered, the reality it rewrote. Betrayal is not some minor wound, it is an earthquake of the soul. It shakes the very foundation of who you are, what you thought was real, and what you believed about loyalty, love, and meaning. But listen closely. In that wreckage, something else is born. The power to see clearly, the strength to rise deliberately, and the wisdom to never collapse in the same way again. This isn't just about pain, it's about transformation. Because if you're willing to face the truth, if you're willing to stand in the ruins long enough to rebuild, then what once broke you will become the very ground you rise from. Welcome to your rising. Welcome to your return. Welcome to the power to rise again. Betrayal is not just a wound, it's a revelation. When someone betrays you, it's natural to think of it as a singular act, a cut, a break, a wound inflicted by another. But the deeper reality is that betrayal doesn't just injure, it reveals. It pulls back the curtain on what was hidden. It brings to light truths that had been suppressed or disguised under the illusion of trust, familiarity, or affection. And while the pain is undeniable, the insight it leaves behind can be transformational, if you're willing to face it. You see, betrayal is a kind of spiritual X-ray. It exposes fractures in people and relationships you thought were solid. Often you trusted blindly, you gave people the benefit of the doubt, you assumed their words matched their intentions, that loyalty was mutual, and that you were walking through life side by side with someone who cared as deeply as you did. When that illusion is shattered, the shock is not just emotional, it's existential. It forces you to reconsider what you thought you knew, not only about others, but also about yourself. That's the hidden violence of betrayal, not just the act itself, but the destruction of meaning. It rewrites history. It casts shadows over past conversations, shared memories, inside jokes, and vulnerable moments. Suddenly, you're looking back through a different lens, questioning everything. Was it all a lie? Were the signs always there and I just didn't want to see them? Why didn't I notice? This disorientation, while deeply painful, is also where the transformation begins. Because betrayal strips away the comfortable illusions that might have kept you stagnant. It disrupts the status quo. It destroys the false, and in doing so, makes room for the true. That's not a justification, it's a reality. Growth often begins at the point of devastation. When the scaffolding of false belief collapses, you're left standing in front of a raw truth that demands something more from you. The beauty, if there is any to be found in such devastation, lies in what is revealed about you. Betrayal may uncover the weakness of others, but it also introduces you to your own resilience. You discover that you can survive what you thought would break you, that you can feel despair, disillusionment, even rage, and still move forward, slowly, deliberately, with more clarity than you had before. More importantly, betrayal teaches discernment. You begin to look at people not just through the lens of hope or desire, but with a sober eye. You listen differently. You observe more deeply. You don't stop loving, but you begin to love with wisdom. You no longer hand over your trust casually because you've learned its value through its loss. And that is the paradox of betrayal. While it wounds, it also awakens. It confronts you with the depth of your own capacity for faith, loyalty, and hope, and then forces you to decide what to do with that capacity once it's been violated. You can choose to close off, to harden, to live in suspicion, or you can choose to rebuild, but this time with stronger walls, clearer boundaries, and a deeper understanding of what trust truly means. So, no, betrayal is not just a wound, it is a mirror, a revelation. And if you let it, it can become the very beginning of your evolution. Pain is the compass toward truth. In the wake of betrayal, pain doesn't just show up as an emotional reaction. It arrives as a force of nature. It settles into the body, presses into the chest, disrupts sleep, and echoes in quiet moments. It's tempting to run from it, to distract ourselves with noise, with busyness, with surface-level comfort. But pain, when understood properly, is not the enemy. It is the compass. It points you toward the places you need to look, the questions you need to ask, and the truths you've been avoiding. Pain is never random. It always reveals something. It sharpens your awareness. It draws your attention to the gap between what you believed and what actually is. That gap, the space between illusion and reality, is where the pain lives. And the more you try to suppress it, the louder it becomes. It doesn't disappear just because you deny it. In fact, avoidance only gives it more power, more space to grow in the shadows. When betrayal hits, one of the first things people often do is question their own worth. They internalize the offense and make it about themselves. What did I miss? Was I not enough? Why would someone do this to me? These questions emerge not because you are weak, but because the pain is trying to lead you somewhere deeper. It's trying to show you not just what happened, but why it affected you so profoundly. There's something personal in the pain, and that's where the truth lives. Emotional pain, especially after betrayal, also points out the ways in which we ignored our own intuition. Perhaps there were red flags we rationalized away. Maybe our fear of confrontation kept us silent when we should have spoken. Or perhaps we projected our own integrity onto someone who hadn't earned it. Pain forces a confrontation with those overlooked moments, not to punish us, but to wake us up, to make us aware of how we got here and how not to repeat the pattern again. This is why pain can be so transformational. It breaks down the old architecture of belief, but it also demands new construction. It makes you reevaluate what you value, what you need, and what you will no longer accept. It strips away the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about who people are, about who we are, and replaces them with sharper, clearer insight. That process is not comfortable. In fact, it often feels like a form of dying, the death of an old self, an old worldview. But what emerges after is something far more authentic. There is a kind of clarity that only pain can provide. It refines you, it humbles you, it pulls your focus away from the superficial and back toward what actually matters: dignity, truth, character, alignment. You stop chasing validation from others and start seeking congruence within yourself. That shift doesn't happen through comfort. It happens through suffering that refuses to be wasted. Pain is also the birthplace of empathy. When you've been cracked open by betrayal, you start to see others with more depth. You recognize suffering in their eyes. You notice when people are walking through their own silent wars. And in some way, that makes you more human. Not weaker, but wiser. You become someone who understands both the heights of trust and the devastation of its collapse. And that gives your presence a kind of gravity that can't be faked. So, don't rush past the pain. Don't cover it up with false positivity or dismiss it with cliches. Sit with it. Listen to it. Let it guide you to the truth. Not just about what happened, but about who you are now becoming. Because the path to healing doesn't detour around pain, it moves through it. And it's in that movement that you begin to reclaim your power. You don't heal by erasing the past, you heal by rebuilding a stronger self. In the immediate aftermath of betrayal, many people instinctively want to erase the memory of what happened. They wish they could go back to the way things were before, or somehow hit a switch that deletes the pain, the disappointment, and the confusion. That desire is deeply human. To rewind the story, to unlive the trauma, to forget the faces that hurt us. But true healing does not come from pretending the past never existed. It comes from rebuilding yourself in full view of everything you've endured and choosing deliberately to become someone who is stronger because of it. Trying to forget betrayal is like trying to tear pages out of your own story. It may offer temporary relief, but it also leaves you fragmented, disconnected from the very experiences that shaped your understanding of the world. The goal isn't to live without pain. The goal is to live in spite of it, to carry the wound without allowing it to define you. And that begins with a brutal kind of honesty, acknowledging what happened, how it changed you, and what needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. You see, betrayal doesn't just take from you emotionally, it dismantles parts of your identity and makes you question your judgment, your sense of value, and your understanding of relationships. In some cases, it even strips you of your confidence to trust your own instincts. That's why healing is not a return to who you were. That version of you was built in a different world, a different reality. One where the betrayal had not yet occurred. Now you're living in a new one, and that requires a new version of you. Rebuilding yourself means making the conscious decision to become more integrated, more aligned with truth, and more protective of your peace. It requires strength, but not the kind that's loud or aggressive. It's the quiet kind of strength, the kind that says, I will not be defined by this. It's the type of inner resolve that allows you to feel everything deeply, to sit in the discomfort of grief and anger, and still rise each morning with a commitment to yourself. And that commitment isn't about perfection, it's about progression. Some days will feel heavy, some memories will still sting. But healing isn't a straight line, and it's not measured by how much you forget. It's measured by how well you function with full knowledge of the pain and how much wisdom you're able to extract from it. Over time, the betrayal becomes less of a weight and more of a marker, a signpost in your personal history that says, this was the moment I stopped running from myself. This was when I began to rebuild. In that rebuilding process, you begin to make different choices. You speak more clearly. You walk more intentionally. You no longer give people easy access to your inner world, not out of fear, but out of respect for your emotional boundaries. You start to see yourself not as a victim of someone else's decision, but as the architect of your own recovery. That shift in identity, from broken to building, is where your power lives. You may never get an apology, you may never fully understand why they did what they did, but you don't need those answers in order to heal. Because healing is not about them, it's about you. It's about who you choose to become after you've been torn open. And the person who emerges from that darkness, slowly and with resolve, is someone far more grounded, far more real, and far more unshakable than the one who walked in blindly. You don't erase the past to heal. You face it, you learn from it, and then you rebuild, brick by brick, choice by choice, into someone who will never be broken the same way again. Forgiveness is not weakness, it's control over the narrative. Forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood aspects of healing, especially after betrayal. Too often it's mistaken for weakness, a surrender of principles, a quiet acceptance of wrongs done, or an invitation for further mistreatment. But that interpretation couldn't be further from the truth. Forgiveness, when understood in its mature and grounded form, is not a passive act. It is a power move. It is not about letting someone else off the hook. It is about removing their influence from your mind and reclaiming authorship over your story. After betrayal, the instinct to hold on to anger feels righteous. You were hurt. You were misled. You were taken for granted. And there's a certain fire that comes with that realization. A fire that says, I will never let this go until justice is served. That fire is valid. In fact, for a time it can be energizing. It reminds you of your worth, your boundaries, and the depth of the harm that was done. But over time, if that fire isn't managed, it stops serving you and starts consuming you. It keeps you tethered to a chapter that's already over, repeating the same emotional scenes long after the players have exited. This is where forgiveness steps in, not as an act of denial, but as a decision to no longer be emotionally enslaved to the actions of others. You are not saying that what happened was okay. You are not absolving the betrayer of responsibility. You are simply refusing to let their decisions define the rest of your emotional life. Forgiveness is not erasure, it's elevation. It's choosing to live above the toxicity rather than drown in it. Forgiveness is also a reclamation of perspective. When you forgive, you begin to reframe the narrative. No longer are you just the person who was betrayed. You are now the person who saw the truth, processed the pain, and chose to release yourself from the emotional grip of that history. That shift is powerful. It means your identity is no longer shaped by victimhood, but by conscious action. It means you've transitioned from merely reacting to directing the arc of your story. And this kind of forgiveness doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. It often begins in moments of deep inner conflict where your head says, I want peace, but your heart still clings to resentment. That tension is real and it's necessary. Because forgiveness at its core is a form of grief, a letting go not only of the offense, but of the version of life you once believed in. You mourn the loss of innocence, the collapse of expectations, the crumbling of trust. And once that mourning is honored, space opens up. Space for clarity, space for freedom. Perhaps the most profound truth about forgiveness is this. It's for you. It's not a favor to the one who hurt you. It's not a ticket to reconciliation or a guarantee that things will ever return to how they were. Forgiveness is a quiet declaration that your peace matters more than your pride, that you are no longer waiting for someone else's regret to heal you, that you are choosing actively to move forward without dragging the weight of bitterness behind you. To forgive is to take back control, not just of your emotions, but of your narrative. It is to say, yes, this happened. Yes, it hurt. But I refuse to let this moment define the totality of who I am. In that decision, you become larger than the betrayal. You rise above it, not because you were untouched by it, but because you refuse to remain defined by it. Rising again is not a return. It's a reinvention. One of the most deceptive myths in healing is the idea that recovery means returning to who you once were before the pain. That somehow, if you work hard enough, process long enough, and forgive deeply enough, you'll get back to the person you were before the betrayal, before the heartbreak, before the collapse. But that belief is not only unrealistic, it's misguided. Healing is not about going back. You don't bounce back from betrayal, you rebuild forward. And what emerges from that process isn't a restored version of the past, it's a completely redefined future. This is not a return, it's a reinvention. The reason you can't return to who you were is because that version of you didn't yet carry the wisdom of pain. That version hadn't yet been broken open, hadn't been forced to confront what happens when trust is weaponized or when love is taken for granted. That version of you lived under a different understanding of people and of yourself. The shattering of that understanding, while deeply painful, also cleared the way for truth, for depth, for discernment, for the kind of self-acknowledge that cannot be gained from comfort. When you rise after betrayal, you don't just rise with scars, you rise with vision. You begin to build a life that's not rooted in naive hope or blind optimism, but in hard-earned clarity. You begin to set boundaries, not out of fear, but out of alignment with your values. You communicate differently. You watch more closely. You no longer confuse closeness with connection or words with integrity. You realize that healing has made you more capable, not less trusting, more conscious of what deserves your energy, not more closed off. This reinvention is not always glamorous. Sometimes it looks like solitude, like taking a step back from everyone and everything so you can hear your own voice again. Sometimes it means sitting in the quiet after the noise has died down and acknowledging that parts of you still ache, still question, still long for what was lost. But this time, you don't run from those parts. You meet them with compassion. You bring them into the rebuilding process, not as weaknesses, but as reminders that what you're constructing now has been forged in truth. And in this new structure, strength looks different. It's not performative. It's not about appearing unfazed or pretending you were never hurt. It's about knowing exactly what you've been through and refusing to let it define your potential. You stop living in reaction to what broke you and start creating from a place of deliberate vision. You become more than someone who survived. You become someone who created themselves out of the ashes. Reinvention also means choosing a new kind of future, not one built out of bitterness, but out of intention. You may carry the memory of betrayal, but you no longer carry the weight of it. You no longer wake up in defense of your worth. You now embody it. You no longer wait for others to validate your journey. You walk it, knowing that every step you take has been earned through fire and through faith. The person who rises after betrayal is not the same person who fell. They are stronger, not because they are invincible, but because they have chosen growth over stagnation, truth over illusion, and peace over revenge. That kind of rising doesn't return you to who you were. It unveils who you were always meant to become.